Hey guys, welcome back to Candlelit History, where the past speaks softly and no emperor is safe from a gentle roasting. Tonight, we drift through the dusty corridors of forgotten palaces to meet rulers so astonishingly incompetent, their reigns became lessons in how not to govern an empire. These weren't just flawed men, they were human disasters in golden robes, stumbling through history with a crown and no clue. If this kind of quiet chaos helps you wind down, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing the map light up with fellow night owls. Now get comfortable, let the noise of the day fall away, and follow me into the strange, sleepy world of history's most useless emperors. Picture this. You're living in the most powerful empire the world has ever known. Your armies stretch across 3 continents. Your engineering marvels inspire awe from Britain to Egypt. Your legal system forms the foundation of civilization itself. And then your emperor decides that what the empire really needs is for him to personally fight wild animals in the gladiatorial arena while dressed as the mythical hero Hercules. This wasn't a fever dream. This was Tuesday afternoon in the Roman Empire under Commodus. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus ruled Rome from 180 to 192 CE, and in those 12 short years, he managed to transform the height of Roman civilization into something resembling a very expensive circus act. But Commodus wasn't just incompetent in the traditional sense of poor military strategy or fiscal irresponsibility. He was incompetent in ways that were so creative, so bizarrely theatrical, that they almost deserve recognition as a form of performance art. Commodus believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules, not metaphorically, not in a spiritual sense. He literally thought he was a demigod walking among mortals, and he decided that the best way to demonstrate his divine nature was to spend most of his time fighting in gladiatorial contests, often against opponents who had been deliberately weakened or given inferior weapons to ensure his victory. Imagine being a Roman citizen, proud of your empire's military might and cultural achievements, watching your emperor prance around the Colosseum in a lion's skin, flexing his muscles and demanding that the Senate officially recognize him as Hercules reborn. The same Senate that was supposed to be governing an empire spanning from Scotland to Sudan was instead being forced to sit through what amounted to the world's most expensive one-man show. But Commodus's theatrical delusions were just the beginning. He renamed Rome itself after himself, calling it Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles and epithets. September became Amazonius, in honor of his supposed connection to the mythical warrior women. The Roman legions, those disciplined military units that had conquered most of the known world, were renamed Commodian legions. This wasn't just vanity. This was a systematic erasure of Roman identity in favor of one man's fantasy about his own divine nature. And while Commodus was busy playing dress-up and renaming everything in sight, the actual business of governing an empire was left to others. Corrupt officials sold positions and favors. The Praetorian Guard, supposed to protect the emperor, became little more than a private militia for whoever could pay them the most. Provincial governors operated with virtually no oversight, treating their territories as personal kingdoms. The economic consequences were devastating. Commodus's gladiatorial obsession wasn't cheap. The games he sponsored cost enormous sums, money that came from increasingly desperate taxation and debasement of the currency. Roman coins, once the most trusted medium of exchange in the ancient world, became so debased with cheaper metals that merchants began refusing them in favor of barter. But perhaps most telling was how Commodus chose to spend his final years. Rather than addressing the growing crisis in his empire, he retreated further into his Hercules fantasy. He commissioned hundreds of statues of himself depicted as the hero, complete with lion skin and club. He even had plans to appear at the New Year's Day ceremonies, dressed as a gladiator, emerging from the gladiator quarters rather than the imperial palace. The Roman elite had endured 12 years of this performance, watching their empire slowly crumble while their emperor played mythological dress-up. On December 31st, 192 CE, they decided they'd seen enough. Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, ending what historians would later call one of the most surreal reigns in Roman history. The irony is almost too perfect. Commodus, who spent his entire reign trying to prove he was a legendary hero, met his end in the most mundane way possible, murdered by his own courtiers while taking a bath. No epic battle, no dramatic last stand, just a very ordinary death for a very extraordinary fool. But Commodus represents something deeper than simple incompetence. He embodied the ultimate imperial delusion, the belief that being emperor meant you could reshape reality itself according to your personal fantasies. He wasn't content to simply rule badly. He needed to transform the entire empire into a stage for his own psychological drama. And perhaps that's what made him so uniquely useless. A bad emperor might lose battles or mismanage finances. But Commodus did something far more insidious. He made the very concept of Roman imperial authority look ridiculous. When your emperor spends his time fighting crippled gladiators while dressed as a mythological figure, it becomes very difficult for anyone to take imperial power seriously. The damage Commodus inflicted wasn't just political or economic. It was cultural and psychological. He turned one of history's most successful imperial systems into a joke, and the Romans never quite recovered that sense of imperial dignity and purpose. The crisis of the 3rd century, the period of near-constant civil war and economic collapse that followed shortly after his death, can be traced directly to the institutional damage he caused. Commodus proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing an emperor can do isn't to be cruel or warlike or even completely incompetent. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is to be ridiculous, because once people start laughing at imperial authority, it becomes very difficult to make them take it seriously again. And as we drift deeper into this exploration of imperial failure, we'll discover that Commodus was far from alone in his talent for spectacular uselessness. Across different cultures and centuries, rulers have found increasingly creative ways to destroy everything their predecessors built, often while convinced they were performing acts of genius. The throne, it seems, has always had a peculiar ability to transform ordinary human folly into empire-ending catastrophe. In the halls of ancient power, few names carry more weight than those who have held absolute authority over vast empires and countless lives. We've explored the brilliant and the bold, the visionary and the victorious. But tonight, we turn our attention to a different breed of ruler entirely. The ones who inherited crowns they couldn't wear, wielded scepters they couldn't hold, and commanded empires they couldn't comprehend. These are the stories of history's most spectacularly useless emperors, men who turned golden ages into dark chapters, who transformed mighty civilizations into cautionary tales, and who proved that sometimes the greatest threat to an empire isn't external invasion or natural disaster, but the simple, devastating incompetence of the person wearing the crown. From the marble halls of Rome to the jade palaces of ancient China, from the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the sun-baked courts of medieval Europe, we'll meet rulers whose reigns were defined not by conquest or wisdom, but by a staggering inability to understand the basic requirements of leadership. These weren't merely bad emperors, they were catastrophically, almost impressively terrible ones. What makes an emperor truly useless? It's not just political failure or military defeat, though our subjects excelled at both. It's something deeper, a fundamental disconnect between the responsibilities of absolute power and the capacity to wield it. These were rulers who confused personal whims with state policy, who mistook ceremony for governance, and who believed that wearing a crown automatically conferred the wisdom to rule. Some inherited empires at their peak and managed to drive them into the ground through sheer incompetence. Others took already struggling realms and accelerated their collapse with decisions so baffling that historians still struggle to explain them. A few were so detached from reality that they seemed to inhabit entirely different worlds from the people they supposedly governed. Their stories are often darkly comic, filled with absurd proclamations, bizarre obsessions, and moments of such profound misunderstanding of basic statecraft that they read like satire. Yet behind the humor lies genuine tragedy, the collapse of institutions, the suffering of millions, and the waste of human potential on an epic scale. These emperors teach us something profound about power itself. They show us that authority without wisdom is not just useless, it's actively destructive. They remind us that the machinery of state, no matter how well built, can be brought to a grinding halt by incompetent leadership, and they demonstrate that sometimes the most dangerous person in an empire is the one who sits on its throne. Tonight, we'll journey through palaces where paranoia reigned supreme, throne rooms where madness masqueraded as divine will, and courts where the distance between ruler and reality grew so vast that entire civilizations paid the price. We'll witness the spectacular failures of men who had everything handed to them and managed to lose it all, often in the most ridiculous ways imaginable. You've successfully navigated through the labyrinth of royal courts, survived the harsh realities of medieval winters, and witnessed the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. But now, we turn to a different kind of power, one that didn't rely on bloodlines or conquest, but on pure intellectual force and strategic brilliance. In the shadowy corridors of European politics during the late 18th century, there emerged figures who wielded influence, not through inherited titles, but through cunning, manipulation, and an almost supernatural ability to read the human heart. These were the puppet masters of their age, individuals who could topple governments with a whisper, broker peace with a letter, or destroy reputations with a single well-placed rumor. Among these shadowy figures, none was more enigmatic or more powerful than Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. Born into French nobility in 1754, Talleyrand would become the most skilled diplomat of his era, serving under 5 different regimes and somehow managing not only to survive, but to thrive through the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the restoration of the monarchy. What made Talleyrand so remarkably effective wasn't his charm, though he possessed that in abundance. It wasn't his noble birth, though that certainly opened doors. It was his absolute mastery of what we might call political, emotional intelligence, the ability to understand exactly what motivated each person he encountered, and to use that knowledge with surgical precision. Talleyrand famously said that speech was given to man to disguise his thoughts, and he elevated this principle to an art form. He could sit across from Napoleon himself and appear to be his most loyal servant while secretly negotiating with the emperor's enemies. He could convince the restored Bourbon monarchy that he had always been their faithful ally, despite having voted for the execution of Louis XVI during the Revolution. But Talleyrand's genius wasn't simply in deception. He understood something fundamental about human nature that most politicians miss entirely. People don't act based on logic or even self-interest as they understand it. They act based on how they want to see themselves and how they want others to see them. Talleyrand's great skill was in making others believe that what he wanted them to do was exactly what they had always wanted to do themselves. Consider his masterpiece of manipulation during the Congress of Vienna in 1815. France had just been defeated, Napoleon was in exile, and the victorious powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, were dividing up Europe. France should have been humiliated, reduced to a minor power, perhaps even partitioned. Instead, Talleyrand managed to position France as an equal partner in the negotiations, playing the great powers against each other with such skill that by the end, France emerged with its borders largely intact and its dignity restored. How did he accomplish this miracle? By understanding that each of the victorious powers feared the others more than they feared a defeated France. He convinced Austria that Russia was becoming too powerful. He whispered to Britain that Prussia's ambitions threatened the balance of power. He suggested to Russia that Austria and Britain were secretly conspiring against them. None of these suggestions were lies exactly. They were truths that already existed in the suspicious minds of his listeners. Talleyrand simply amplified them, focused them, and directed them toward his own ends. But perhaps most remarkably, Talleyrand understood the power of appearing powerless. Throughout his career, he cultivated an image of himself as a reluctant participant in politics, someone who would much rather be reading philosophy or collecting art than dealing with the sordid business of government. This pose served him brilliantly because it made others underestimate him while simultaneously making them feel superior and thus more generous in their dealings with him. The truth was quite different. Talleyrand was perhaps the most ambitious man of his age, but he had learned that naked ambition makes enemies, while concealed ambition makes allies. He allowed others to take credit for his ideas, to believe they had convinced him rather than the reverse, to feel that they were using him rather than being used by him. This strategy of strategic self-diminishment was evident in his famous limp. Talleyrand had been born with a clubfoot, and rather than hiding this disability, he turned it into a political asset. The limp made him appear vulnerable, even pathetic, which caused opponents to lower their guard around him. It also served as a perfect metaphor for his entire approach to power. He moved slowly, seemingly awkwardly, but always in exactly the direction he intended. Talleyrand's influence extended far beyond the formal diplomatic sphere. He was a master of what we would now call soft power, understanding that the right dinner party could be more effective than a dozen formal negotiations. His salon became the unofficial center of European diplomacy, where over excellent wine and carefully orchestrated conversation, the real business of statecraft was conducted. He knew that people revealed their true thoughts not in official meetings, but in unguarded moments, after the third glass of champagne, during a casual walk in the garden, in the brief interval between courses at dinner. Talleyrand was always listening, always observing, always filing away information that might prove useful months or years later. But what truly set Talleyrand apart was his understanding of timing. He knew that in politics, as in comedy, timing is everything. He could wait years for the perfect moment to deploy a piece of information or to make a crucial suggestion. He understood that premature action, no matter how brilliant, often fails, while even mediocre ideas can succeed if introduced at exactly the right moment. This patience was perhaps most evident in his relationship with Napoleon. For years, Talleyrand served as the emperor's foreign minister, helping to build the vast empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But even at the height of Napoleon's power, Talleyrand was quietly preparing for his master's downfall. He began secret negotiations with Napoleon's enemies, not out of treachery, but out of a clear-eyed assessment that the emperor's ambitions were ultimately unsustainable. When Napoleon finally fell, Talleyrand was perfectly positioned to facilitate the transition to the new regime. He had maintained relationships with all the key players, had never fully committed himself to any single course of action, and had carefully preserved his reputation as a moderate voice of reason. To the victorious allies, he appeared to be exactly what they needed, a French statesman who could help stabilize the country without threatening their interests. This ability to position himself as indispensable to successive regimes was perhaps Talleyrand's greatest political achievement. In an age of violent revolution and rapid political change, when most politicians were lucky to survive a single regime change, Talleyrand managed to remain relevant and powerful through 5 completely different governments. He served the Ancien Regime as a bishop, the Revolution as a constitutional moderate, the Directory as a diplomatic representative, Napoleon as foreign minister, and the restored monarchy as elder statesman and advisor. Each transition required him to reinvent himself while maintaining continuity, to appear to change while remaining essentially the same. It was a performance of extraordinary subtlety and skill, requiring not just political acumen, but a deep understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Talleyrand's methods were not always admirable. He betrayed confidences when it served his purposes. But his defenders would argue that in the chaotic and violent world of late 18th and early 19th century Europe, such flexibility was not just useful, but necessary for survival. More importantly, Talleyrand's manipulations often served broader purposes than mere personal advancement. His secret negotiations with Napoleon's enemies helped to end a war that was devastating Europe. His work at the Congress of Vienna helped to establish a balance of power that would preserve peace for nearly a century. His support for constitutional monarchy in France helped to prevent the kind of violent, revolutionary cycles that plagued other European nations. In this sense, Talleyrand represents a particular type of political genius, the ability to serve one's own interests while simultaneously serving larger historical forces. He understood that true power comes not from opposing the tide of history, but from positioning oneself to ride it, to guide it subtly toward one's preferred destination while allowing others to believe they are steering. This approach required an almost superhuman level of emotional detachment. Talleyrand could work closely with someone for years, sharing meals and confidences and apparent friendship, while simultaneously planning their political destruction if circumstances required it. He famously said that one can do everything with bayonets except sit on them, meaning that real power must ultimately rest on something more durable than force alone. For Talleyrand, that something was information, relationships, and the ability to make himself useful to whoever happened to be in charge. He survived and thrived not because he was the strongest or the most righteous, but because he was the most adaptable, the most perceptive, and the most patient. His legacy raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of political morality. Was Talleyrand a cynical opportunist who abandoned every principle for personal advancement? Or was he a pragmatic realist who understood that in politics, purity is often the enemy of effectiveness? Perhaps he was both, or perhaps the question itself misses the point. What seems certain is that Talleyrand possessed a form of intelligence that is rare in any age, and perhaps especially rare in our own. The ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to underlying patterns, to understand not just what people say they want, but what they actually need, and to position oneself not where the power is now, but where it will be tomorrow. In an era of rapid change and apparent chaos, when traditional sources of authority were crumbling and new ones had not yet solidified, Talleyrand created his own form of stability through sheer force of personality and intellect. He became a fixed point around which others could orient themselves, a source of continuity in an age of disruption. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his career, that a man with no army, no inherited throne, and no popular movement behind him could wield such influence for so long. His power was purely intellectual and social, based on his ability to understand and manipulate the complex web of relationships that actually govern human affairs beneath the surface of formal politics. Today, in our own age of rapid change and institutional uncertainty, Talleyrand's example offers both inspiration and warning. His career demonstrates the enormous potential of strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and patient planning. But it also reveals the moral costs of such an approach, the way that constant adaptation and manipulation can erode one's connection to deeper principles and authentic relationships. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Talleyrand's genius is that even now, more than 2 centuries after his death, historians and political scientists continue to debate whether he was a hero or a villain, a master statesman or a skilled charlatan. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the rather twisted tale of the most spectacularly useless emperor in all of history, a man so incompetent, so delusional, and so catastrophically unfit to rule that he turned the mightiest empire on earth into his personal playground while it crumbled around him. This is the story of Commodus, the emperor who thought he was a gladiator, who renamed months after himself, and who nearly destroyed Rome through sheer vanity and madness. So before you get comfortable, Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the last of the great rulers, lay dying in 180 CE. For nearly 2 decades, he had guided Rome with wisdom, stoicism, and careful deliberation. But as his final breath approached, he made a decision that would haunt the empire for generations. Instead of choosing a capable successor from among Rome's finest, he handed the purple to his biological son, Commodus. It was perhaps the greatest mistake in Roman history. Commodus was 18 when he became emperor, young, handsome, and utterly convinced of his own divinity. Where his father had been contemplative and measured, Commodus was impulsive and grandiose. Where Marcus Aurelius had seen the weight of responsibility, Commodus saw only the glory of power. And where the philosopher emperor had worked tirelessly for the good of Rome, his son would work tirelessly for the entertainment of himself. The transformation was swift and shocking. Within months of taking power, Commodus began dismantling the careful structures his father had built. He abandoned the northern campaigns, leaving conquered territories vulnerable to barbarian raids. He dismissed experienced advisors and replaced them with flatterers and sycophants. Most tellingly, he showed no interest whatsoever in the daily business of governing an empire. Instead, Commodus became obsessed with spectacle. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules, a living god walking among mortals. He commissioned hundreds of statues depicting himself as the legendary hero, complete with lion skin and club. He renamed the months of the year after his various titles and epithets. September became Hercules, October became Invictus, November became Exuperatorius. Rome itself was briefly renamed Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. But it was in the arena where Commodus truly revealed his madness. Unlike previous emperors who watched gladiatorial games from the safety of the imperial box, Commodus insisted on participating. He fought as a gladiator, not against dangerous opponents who might actually harm him, but against carefully selected victims and wild animals that had been weakened or drugged beforehand. The spectacle was both ridiculous and terrifying. The Emperor of Rome, dressed in gladiatorial gear, would enter the Colosseum to thunderous applause from crowds who had no choice but to cheer. He would then proceed to slaughter ostriches with specially designed arrows, decapitate hundreds of wild animals, and occasionally fight human opponents who had been instructed to lose convincingly, but not too obviously. Commodus kept meticulous records of his arena performances. He claimed to have killed over 1,000 animals personally, and he charged the Roman treasury enormous sums for each appearance. Every time the emperor played gladiator, it cost the state a fortune, both in the lavish spectacles he demanded and in the neglect of actual governance. Meanwhile, the real business of empire fell to a succession of corrupt officials and opportunistic courtiers. The Praetorian prefect Perennis effectively ruled Rome for several years, enriching himself and his allies while Commodus played dress-up. When Perennis was eventually executed for treason, he was replaced by the equally corrupt Cleander, who openly sold government positions to the highest bidders. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The Roman treasury, built up over generations of careful management, was emptied to fund Commodus's increasingly elaborate fantasies. Taxes soared, the currency was debased, and trade networks began to collapse as merchants lost confidence in Roman stability. Worse still, Commodus's neglect of the military left the empire's borders increasingly vulnerable. Germanic tribes pushed across the Rhine and Danube, while rebellions erupted in Britain and Africa. Each crisis was met not with decisive action, but with theatrical gestures and cosmetic solutions designed more to enhance the emperor's image than to solve actual problems. The Roman Senate, once the empire's guiding council, was reduced to a rubber stamp for imperial whims. Senators who dared to criticize Commodus found themselves facing charges of treason, exile, or execution. Those who survived learned to compete in elaborate displays of flattery, praising the emperor's wisdom, his divine nature, and his magnificent performances in the arena. Perhaps most damaging of all was the message Commodus sent to the empire's subjects about the nature of leadership itself. For generations, Romans had believed that their emperors, whatever their flaws, were fundamentally serious men dedicated to the good of the state. Commodus shattered that illusion completely. He demonstrated that ultimate power could be wielded not for duty or honor, but for personal amusement. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. If the emperor himself treated governance as a game, why should anyone else take civic responsibility seriously? If virtue and competence meant nothing compared to flattery and spectacle, why strive for excellence? The rot that began in the imperial palace spread throughout the empire's institutions. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of Commodus's reign was how long it lasted. For 12 years, from 180 to 192 CE, this theatrical madman remained in power, not because he was beloved, not because he was effective, but because the very systems designed to constrain bad emperors had been corrupted by his predecessor's success. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly the empire's last line of defense against tyranny, had become dependent on imperial largesse. The Senate, theoretically a check on imperial power, had been neutered by decades of subservience. The army, scattered across distant frontiers, was too fragmented to organize effective resistance, and the Roman people, distracted by bread and circuses, seemed content to trade freedom for entertainment. It took a conspiracy of his own courtiers to finally end Commodus's reign. On December 31st, 192 CE, he was strangled in his bath by the wrestler Narcissus, acting on behalf of his mistress Marcia and the Praetorian prefect Latus. Even his death was theatrical, a final act of melodrama to close a reign that had been nothing but performance from beginning to end. But the damage was done. Commodus had proven that the Roman Empire could be ruled by a madman for over a decade without collapsing entirely. He had shown that institutions built over centuries could be corrupted in mere years. Most dangerously, he had demonstrated that power without wisdom, authority without responsibility, and spectacle without substance could coexist for far longer than anyone had imagined possible. The immediate aftermath of his death brought civil war, as competing generals fought for the right to rule an empire that had been weakened by 12 years of neglect. The eventual winner, Septimius Severus, would restore some stability, but Rome would never again achieve the heights it had reached under Marcus Aurelius. Commodus represents something more than just a bad emperor. He embodies the danger of inherited power, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the seductive appeal of spectacle over substance. His reign reminds us that even the most sophisticated political systems can be brought low by leaders who mistake performance for governance, who confuse celebrity with competence, and who believe that the applause of crowds can substitute for the hard work of actual leadership. In the end, Commodus was not just useless, he was actively destructive. He took an empire at its peak and began its long slide toward irrelevance. He transformed the most powerful office on earth into a platform for personal vanity. And he proved that sometimes the greatest threat to a civilization comes not from its enemies, but from leaders who are too small, too selfish, and too deluded to understand the magnitude of what they've been given to protect. The story of Commodus is a warning that echoes across the centuries, a reminder that power without wisdom is not just useless, but dangerous. And in our own age of spectacle and celebrity, his reign feels less like ancient history and more like a cautionary tale for our times. By the early 5th century CE, the Roman Empire that had once conquered most of the known world was gasping for breath. The western half, in particular, was crumbling under the weight of barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and a series of rulers who seemed more interested in palace intrigue than actual governance. And nowhere was this decline more perfectly embodied than in the figure of Honorius, an emperor so spectacularly inept that his reign reads like a dark comedy of imperial incompetence. Honorius became Western Roman Emperor in 395 CE at the tender age of 10. Think about that for a moment. A child was handed control of half the Roman Empire during one of the most turbulent periods in its history. His father, Theodosius the Great, had split the empire between his two sons, giving the eastern half to Arcadius and the west to young Honorius. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic, though perhaps not for the reasons Theodosius anticipated. From the very beginning, Honorius was a puppet emperor. Real power lay in the hands of his general and regent, Stilicho, a half-Vandal military commander who spent most of his energy fighting other Roman generals rather than defending the empire's borders. But even when Honorius came of age, he showed no interest in the burdens of leadership. Instead, he developed an obsession that would define his entire reign: raising chickens. Yes, you heard that correctly. While barbarian hordes swept across Gaul, while the Visigoths sacked Rome itself, Emperor Honorius was in his palace gardens, tending to his beloved poultry. He named his favorite rooster Rome, and when a messenger once burst in to announce that Rome had fallen, Honorius supposedly cried out in anguish, thinking his pet bird had died. Whether this story is entirely accurate or embellished by later historians matters little. The fact that such tales could be believably told about a Roman emperor speaks volumes about his reputation. Honorius had become a living symbol of imperial detachment, a ruler so removed from reality that he couldn't distinguish between his livestock and his capital city. Under his watch, the Western Roman Empire hemorrhaged territory at an alarming rate. Britain was abandoned in 410 CE, left to fend for itself against Saxon raiders. Gaul was overrun by various Germanic tribes who carved out their own kingdoms from former Roman provinces. Spain fell under Visigothic control. North Africa was lost to the Vandals. Each loss was met with the same imperial response: Virtually none at all. The most humiliating moment came in 410 CE when Alaric and his Visigothic army besieged and eventually sacked Rome itself. This was the first time in 800 years that foreign enemies had breached the Eternal City's walls. Citizens were slaughtered, treasures looted, and the myth of Roman invincibility shattered forever. And where was Emperor Honorius during this catastrophe? Safe in his heavily fortified capital of Ravenna, reportedly more concerned about his chickens than his crumbling empire. What made Honorius particularly useless wasn't just his incompetence, but his complete inability to recognize that incompetence. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the empire's decline, as if the loss of entire provinces was simply bad weather that would eventually pass. His court became a bubble of delusion, where courtiers competed to tell him what he wanted to hear, rather than the truth about the empire's desperate situation. Military campaigns under Honorius were exercises in futility. He would appoint generals, then recall them at the first sign of difficulty. He would negotiate treaties with barbarian leaders, then break them for trivial reasons. He showed no understanding of strategy, diplomacy, or even basic statecraft. His decisions seemed random, driven more by palace gossip than imperial necessity. Perhaps most damaging was his treatment of capable subordinates. When Stilicho, despite his flaws, proved to be the only general capable of holding the empire together, Honorius had him executed on trumped-up charges of treason. This eliminated the last competent military leader in the Western Empire and opened the floodgates for barbarian invasion. It was a decision so catastrophically stupid that it essentially signed the death warrant for the Western Roman Empire. The economic situation under Honorius was equally dire. Tax collection collapsed as provinces were lost or devastated by warfare. The imperial treasury was bankrupted by payments to barbarian mercenaries who often turned around and attacked the very territories they were hired to defend. Trade networks that had sustained the empire for centuries simply disintegrated, yet Honorius seemed oblivious to these problems, continuing to live in luxury while his subjects starved. Honorius died in 423 CE, having ruled for 28 years without achieving a single significant success. His death was met with barely concealed relief by what remained of his administration. By the time of his passing, the Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell, controlling little more than Italy, and even that tenuously. Within 50 years of his death, the last Western Roman emperor would be deposed, ending over 1,000 years of Roman rule. What makes Honorius such a perfect example of imperial uselessness is how his personal failings magnified the empire's existing problems. A competent emperor might have managed the barbarian migrations, reformed the military, or at least slowed the empire's decline. Instead, Honorius accelerated it through sheer incompetence, turning manageable crises into existential threats. His legacy is one of catastrophic neglect. Under his reign, the Roman Empire lost its aura of invincibility, its territorial integrity, and ultimately its will to survive. He took an empire that, despite its problems, still commanded respect and fear across the known world, and turned it into a laughingstock. Barbarian chieftains, who once trembled at the mention of Roman legions, now carved up former Roman territories like a feast. Yet perhaps the most telling aspect of Honorius's uselessness was his apparent contentment with failure. While Rome burned quite literally in 410 CE, he remained focused on his chickens, his court ceremonies, and his comfortable delusions. He never seemed to grasp that being emperor meant more than wearing purple and living in a palace. Leadership, responsibility, and sacrifice were concepts that simply never penetrated his consciousness. In the grand catalogue of imperial failures, Honorius stands out, not for any single catastrophic decision, but for his comprehensive inability to rise to the moment. History presented him with challenges that demanded greatness, or at least competence, and he responded with chickens and confusion. He embodied everything wrong with hereditary power, showing how genetic lottery could place the fate of millions in the hands of someone utterly unfit to hold it. The Western Roman Empire's fall was not inevitable, but under Honorius it became unavoidable. His reign serves as a masterclass in how not to lead, a cautionary tale about the dangers of placing power in the hands of those who neither understand nor deserve it. And somewhere in the ruins of his palace, one imagines, the descendants of his beloved chickens pecked through the debris of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Maximilian of Mexico wasn't born to be an emperor. In fact, he was born to be a footnote, a younger brother, a spare heir collecting dust in the Habsburg family tree. Born Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph in 1832, he was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, who would become Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Maximilian was intelligent, well-educated, cultured, and absolutely brimming with romantic notions about glory and empire. He was also completely unprepared for the brutal realities of power. His early life was spent in comfortable obscurity, serving as a naval officer and later as Governor General of the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia. He was actually quite competent in these roles, showing administrative skill and a genuine concern for the welfare of his subjects. But competence in a comfortable Austrian province was very different from ruling a war-torn Mexico in the middle of a civil war. The opportunity that would destroy him came in 1863, when a group of Mexican conservatives approached him with an offer that must have seemed like a dream come true. They wanted him to become Emperor of Mexico. The story they told was seductive. The Mexican people were crying out for stable leadership. They desperately wanted a European monarch to bring order to their chaotic nation, and the French army was there to support him. What they didn't mention was that this was essentially a French puppet operation orchestrated by Napoleon III, who wanted to establish a French-friendly empire in the Americas, while the United States was distracted by its civil war. They also failed to mention that the supposed popular support for a European emperor was largely fictional, that the country was in the middle of a vicious civil war, and that the liberal forces under Benito Juarez controlled most of the territory and had absolutely no intention of accepting foreign rule. But Maximilian, romantic and idealistic as he was, saw visions of bringing European civilization to the New World, of ruling over a grateful people who would appreciate his enlightened governance. His wife, Carlota, daughter of the King of Belgium, was even more enthusiastic about the prospect of becoming an empress. Together, they convinced themselves that this was their destiny. The warning signs were everywhere. The Mexican delegation that offered him the crown claimed to represent the will of the people, but they were clearly a small group of conservative elites with no real popular base. The supposed plebiscite that confirmed his selection was obviously rigged. The French made it clear that their military support was temporary and conditional. Even his own brother, Emperor Franz Joseph, was skeptical about the whole enterprise. But Maximilian wanted to believe. He wanted to be more than just a younger brother, more than just a minor Habsburg archduke. He wanted to make history, to build something grand and lasting. So in 1864, he accepted the crown and sailed to Mexico with his wife, genuinely believing he was answering the call of a grateful nation. What he found when he arrived was nothing like what he had been promised. The French army controlled only a small portion of the country around the capital. Juarez's Republican forces controlled the north and much of the countryside. The treasury was empty. The government barely functioned. And far from being welcomed as a liberator, he was seen by most Mexicans as exactly what he was, a foreign puppet imposed by European powers. Maximilian's first mistake was believing his own propaganda. His second was trying to be a good emperor according to his own liberal European standards, rather than understanding what the situation actually required. He attempted to rule as an enlightened despot, implementing progressive reforms, protecting indigenous rights, and trying to build a modern, efficient state. These were admirable goals, but they were completely disconnected from the reality of a country in the middle of a civil war. His liberal policies alienated the conservative Mexican elites who had invited him in the first place. They wanted a strong hand to restore the old order, not a European idealist who sympathized with indigenous rights and religious freedom. Meanwhile, his very presence as a foreign emperor made it impossible for him to win over the liberal Republicans, no matter how progressive his policies might be. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and the United States immediately began pressuring France to withdraw its troops and stop supporting what they saw as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon III, facing problems in Europe and growing costs in Mexico, decided to cut his losses. In 1866, he announced that French troops would be withdrawn by 1867. Maximilian was faced with an impossible choice. He could abdicate and return to Europe, admitting the complete failure of his imperial adventure. Or he could stay and try to maintain his empire with only Mexican conservative forces, knowing that this would almost certainly mean defeat and possibly death. Carlota sailed back to Europe to plead for continued French support, but the mission was hopeless. She had a complete mental breakdown during the trip and would spend the rest of her life in insanity, perhaps the most tragic victim of the whole doomed enterprise. Maximilian, abandoned by his European allies and facing the advancing Republican forces, made the decision that sealed his fate. He chose to stay and fight. It was perhaps the only genuinely courageous decision he made during his entire reign, but it was also suicidal. His remaining forces were quickly overwhelmed. In 1867, he was captured by Republican troops in Querétaro. Juarez, despite pleas for clemency from European leaders, ordered his execution. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian was shot by firing squad on the Hill of Bells, ending one of history's most quixotic imperial adventures. The execution of Maximilian sent shockwaves through European royal circles. Here was a Habsburg archduke, a man of royal blood, killed by what they saw as Mexican rebels. But for most Mexicans, it was simply justice. A foreign invader had been defeated and punished according to the laws of war. Maximilian's 3-year reign accomplished nothing positive. and caused immense suffering. The civil war he prolonged cost thousands of lives. His presence legitimized foreign intervention in Mexican affairs and deepened political divisions that would plague the country for decades. He bankrupted what little remained of the Mexican treasury and left behind a legacy of failure and foreign humiliation. What makes Maximilian's story particularly tragic is that he wasn't evil or even particularly incompetent by the standards of 19th century monarchs. He was simply completely out of his depth, a romantic idealist thrust into a situation that required either ruthless pragmatism or immediate withdrawal. His fatal flaw was believing that good intentions and enlightened policies could substitute for legitimacy and popular support. The Mexican empire that Maximilian tried to build was doomed from the moment he accepted the crown. It was based on foreign bayonets, supported by a tiny elite, and opposed by the vast majority of the Mexican people. No amount of liberal reforms or administrative competence could overcome these fundamental problems. His execution marked the end of European attempts to establish puppet empires in the Americas during the 19th century. It demonstrated that the age of easy colonial conquest was ending, and that even the backing of major European powers couldn't guarantee success against determined local resistance. Maximilian died believing he had tried to do right by Mexico, and in his final letters, he expressed genuine sorrow for the suffering his reign had caused. But good intentions could not excuse the fundamental folly of accepting a crown offered by foreign conspirators and backed by foreign armies. In the end, Maximilian of Mexico stands as perhaps the most tragic figure among history's useless emperors. Unlike rulers who destroyed their empires through vice, madness, or cruelty, he destroyed his through naive idealism and romantic delusion. He wanted to be a good emperor so badly that he never stopped to ask whether he should be an emperor at all. His brief reign serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial ambition disconnected from reality. It reminds us that even the best intentions can lead to disaster when they're built on foundations of foreign intervention and political illegitimacy. And it shows us that sometimes the most dangerous rulers are not the monsters, but the dreamers who refuse to wake up until it's far too late. By the mid-14th century, the Holy Roman Empire had become something of a political joke. The golden age of powerful emperors who could make popes tremble and reshape continents was long over. Instead, the imperial crown had become a glorified hat passed between squabbling German princes who barely controlled their own backyards, let alone a continent-spanning empire. Into this power vacuum stepped a man so spectacularly unfit for leadership that his reign would make previous imperial disasters look like minor administrative hiccups. Meet Wenceslaus IV, also known as Wenceslaus the Idle, though that nickname barely scratches the surface of his comprehensive incompetence. Born in 1361, Wenceslaus inherited the throne of Bohemia from his father, the capable but increasingly distant Charles IV. When Charles died in 1378, 18-year-old Wenceslaus found himself not only king of Bohemia, but also Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of what was theoretically the most powerful political entity in medieval Europe. What followed was a masterclass in how to systematically destroy an empire through sheer laziness, poor judgment, and an almost supernatural ability to make the wrong decision at every crucial moment. Wenceslaus approached imperial duties with all the enthusiasm of a medieval peasant facing tax collection. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting into dozens of competing principalities. The Catholic Church was split by the Great Western Schism, with multiple popes claiming legitimacy, and German princes were openly defying imperial authority. Wenceslaus' response to these mounting crises was to retreat to his castles in Bohemia and pretend none of it was happening. The emperor's disengagement reached such legendary proportions that imperial business ground to a virtual halt. Important documents went unsigned for months. Diplomatic missions were left waiting for audiences that never came. When pressed by his advisors to address urgent matters of state, Wenceslaus would often declare that he was too tired or too busy with more important matters, which usually meant organizing elaborate hunting expeditions or supervising the construction of new wine cellars. His court became a revolving door of frustrated officials who would arrive with critical imperial business only to be told that His Majesty was indisposed and would see them at some unspecified future date. Perhaps most damaging was Wenceslaus' complete inability to manage the empire's chronic financial problems. The imperial treasury was essentially bankrupt, drained by decades of military campaigns, territorial disputes, and the enormous cost of maintaining the imperial bureaucracy. Rather than implementing reforms or seeking new sources of revenue, Wenceslaus simply borrowed more money from increasingly skeptical bankers and sold off imperial properties to raise quick cash. When those sources dried up, he began debasing the currency, flooding the market with coins that contained less and less actual silver or gold. The result was rampant inflation that devastated trade and made the empire's financial situation even worse. The emperor's approach to foreign policy was equally disastrous. The Holy Roman Empire was surrounded by ambitious neighbors, eager to exploit any sign of weakness, and Wenceslaus provided them with ample opportunities. When the Ottoman Empire began expanding into the Balkans, threatening the empire's southeastern borders, Wenceslaus failed to organize any meaningful military response. When France and England asked for imperial mediation in their ongoing conflicts, he ignored their requests entirely. When Italian city-states appealed for imperial intervention in their territorial disputes, he sent form letters expressing his general goodwill but offering no concrete assistance. The situation became so dire that even the notoriously dysfunctional German princes began to take notice. These were men who spent most of their time fighting each other over inheritance disputes and trade routes. But even they recognized that having a completely absent emperor was bad for everyone's business. In 1400, a group of 4 electoral princes took the unprecedented step of formally deposing Wenceslaus as Holy Roman Emperor, citing his notorious negligence and manifest incapacity to fulfill his imperial duties. They replaced him with Rupert of the Palatinate, a competent if unremarkable prince who at least showed up for work. Remarkably, Wenceslaus seemed largely unbothered by his deposition. While most medieval rulers would have raised armies and fought bitter wars to reclaim their lost crowns, Wenceslaus simply shrugged and continued ruling Bohemia as if nothing had happened. He made a few half-hearted attempts to assert his imperial claims, mostly involving strongly worded letters and threats of excommunication, but when these failed to restore his authority, he apparently decided that being emperor was more trouble than it was worth anyway. The deposed emperor's remaining years were spent in a haze of hedonistic pursuits that would have made Caligula blush. He surrounded himself with a court of flatterers, artists, and entertainers who encouraged his worst impulses while systematically looting what remained of the Bohemian treasury. Lavish banquets became a nightly occurrence, featuring exotic foods imported at enormous expense and entertainment that often lasted until dawn. When not feasting, Wenceslaus devoted himself to hunting with an obsession that bordered on mania, maintaining enormous kennels of hunting dogs and employing armies of foresters and gamekeepers to manage his private hunting reserves. The emperor's personal life became the subject of scandalous gossip throughout European courts. He went through multiple wives and countless mistresses, often abandoning formal state functions to pursue romantic entanglements. His marriages were political disasters, as he repeatedly offended potential allies by breaking engagement agreements or treating foreign princesses with casual disrespect. When his first wife died under mysterious circumstances, rumors spread that she had been poisoned by one of his mistresses, though Wenceslaus seemed more concerned with planning his next wedding than investigating his previous wife's death. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire continued its slow-motion collapse without him. Rupert of the Palatinate proved to be a capable administrator, but lacked the resources and authority to reverse decades of imperial decline. The German princes continued their endless feuding, the papal schism deepened, and the Ottoman threat grew more serious with each passing year. By the time Wenceslaus died in 1419, the Holy Roman Empire had effectively ceased to function as a coherent political entity, reduced to a loose confederation of independent principalities, united only by their shared use of the German language and their mutual contempt for imperial authority. What makes Wenceslaus particularly fascinating as a case study in imperial incompetence is that his failures weren't the result of mental illness, foreign manipulation, or impossible circumstances. Unlike some of history's other disastrous rulers, he inherited a functional government, a stable succession, and advisors who genuinely wanted to help him succeed. His empire faced serious challenges, certainly, but none that were insurmountable, with competent leadership and sustained effort. Instead, Wenceslaus simply chose not to engage with the responsibilities of power, treating the Holy Roman Empire like an elaborate trust fund that existed solely for his personal enjoyment. The emperor's legacy lived on in the political fragmentation that would define Central Europe for centuries to come. Without effective imperial authority, the German principalities developed increasingly independent identities and institutions, setting the stage for the religious wars and territorial conflicts that would devastate the region well into the modern era. The weakness of imperial institutions also created power vacuums that were filled by other rising powers, particularly France and the Ottoman Empire, fundamentally altering the balance of European politics. Perhaps most tellingly, Wenceslaus' reign demonstrated how quickly even ancient and powerful institutions could collapse when their leaders simply stopped caring about them. The Holy Roman Empire had survived barbarian invasions, papal conflicts, and numerous succession crises, but it couldn't survive an emperor who treated his duties as optional suggestions rather than sacred obligations. In the end, Wenceslaus the Idle proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy of any empire isn't external conquest or internal rebellion, but simple, persistent, inexcusable laziness. His story serves as a reminder that power without responsibility is merely elaborate entertainment, and that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the individuals entrusted to lead them. Continuing from where we left off, the story of history's most useless emperors takes a darker turn as we explore rulers who didn't just fail through incompetence, but whose very nature seemed designed for disaster. These weren't leaders who stumbled into mistakes. They were walking cautionary tales about what happens when absolute power meets absolute unsuitability. Emperor Caligula of Rome stands as perhaps the most infamous example of imperial madness masquerading as divine right. Born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, as in 12 CE, he earned the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, from the miniature military sandals he wore as a child while accompanying his father Germanicus on campaign. What seemed endearing in childhood would transform into something far more sinister when that same child inherited the most powerful throne in the world. Caligula's reign began in 37 CE with genuine promise. The Roman people, exhausted by the paranoid final years of Tiberius, welcomed the young emperor with enthusiasm. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire had found its golden prince, but within months, and everything changed. Some historians suggest a severe illness early in his reign damaged his mind. Others argue that absolute power simply revealed the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface. What followed was 4 years of unprecedented madness. Caligula declared himself a living god, demanding to be worshipped throughout the empire. He had conversations with statues of Jupiter, claiming they were divine consultations. He appointed his horse, Incitatus, to the Senate, not as a joke, but as a serious political appointment. The horse lived in a marble stable, ate from an ivory manger, and wore a jeweled collar. Caligula reportedly planned to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in Rome, after the emperor himself. His cruelty knew no bounds. He forced senators to run beside his chariot for miles in their togas. He made them worship him as a god, prostrating themselves before his golden statue. When the people of Alexandria refused to place his image in their synagogue, he threatened to destroy the entire city. He built a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, simply so he could ride across it wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, proving to a soothsayer who had said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae, that prophecies meant nothing to a god. But perhaps most devastating to the empire was his financial recklessness. 7 billion sesterces from the frugal Tiberius. Within a year, he had spent it all on games, spectacles, bonuses, and building projects that served no purpose beyond his own glorification. He built ships that were floating palaces, complete with marble columns and vineyards. He constructed a bridge connecting his palace to the temple of Jupiter so he could visit his brother whenever he pleased. When the money ran out, he instituted new taxes on lawsuits, marriages, and prostitution. He auctioned off gladiators at outrageous prices, forcing wealthy Romans to bid against their will. The emperor's paranoia grew with his megalomania. He began executing people for the slightest perceived insults. Senators were killed for not paying him sufficient honor. Citizens were executed for discussing his policies. He forced men to watch their sons' executions. then invited them to dinner afterward, expecting them to laugh and joke as if nothing had happened. Those who showed grief were killed for disrespecting the emperor's justice. By 41 CE, even the Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most loyal supporters, had seen enough. On January 24th, Caligula was assassinated by members of his own guard while leaving the theater. He was stabbed 30 times, his wife Caesonia was murdered, and his infant daughter Julia Drusilla was killed by having her head smashed against a wall. The Senate briefly considered restoring the Republic, but the Praetorians had already proclaimed Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as the new emperor. Caligula's reign lasted only 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. But the damage he inflicted on the empire was immense. He had bankrupted the treasury, terrorized the aristocracy, and demonstrated to the world that Rome's emperor could be a madman with unlimited power. His legacy served as a template for future tyrants and a reminder that in an autocracy, the character of one man could determine the fate of millions. Yet Caligula was not an anomaly in the long line of imperial disasters. His successor Nero would prove that lightning could indeed strike twice, and that the Roman system of governance had no effective safeguards against a ruler determined to destroy everything his predecessors had built. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, came to power in 54 CE at the age of 16, making him one of the youngest emperors in Roman history. Like Caligula, his reign began with promise. Guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, young Nero initially showed signs of competent leadership. He reduced taxes, gave the Senate more autonomy, and even declared his intention to end all executions, a radical departure from the paranoid bloodletting of previous reigns. But as Nero aged, his true nature emerged. He was an artist trapped in an emperor's body, a man who believed his talents as a performer far exceeded his responsibilities as a ruler. He began appearing on public stages, singing and playing the lyre, forcing audiences to sit through hours-long performances that they dared not criticize. Roman aristocrats, who viewed acting as beneath their dignity, watched in horror as their emperor pranced about in costume, competing in chariot races and theatrical competitions that he invariably won, not through skill, but through fear. Nero's artistic obsessions consumed more and more of his time and the empire's resources. He built the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, a massive palace complex that covered a third of Rome. Its entrance hall featured a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero as the sun god. The dining rooms had revolving ceilings that showered guests with flowers and perfume. One room had a domed ceiling that rotated like the heavens. The palace grounds included an artificial lake, vineyards, and pastures, all in the heart of the city. Romans joked bitterly that Nero would soon extend his house all the way to his villa in Antium, swallowing Rome entirely. But Nero's greatest crime, and the one that would define his legacy, occurred on the night of July 18th, 64 CE. A fire broke out in the shops around the Circus Maximus and quickly spread through Rome's crowded neighborhoods. The blaze raged for 6 days and 7 nights, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts. Hundreds of thousands of Romans lost their homes, and countless lives were lost in the inferno. Legend claims that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, though the fiddle hadn't been invented yet. The truth was both more complex and more damning. Nero was in Antium when the fire started and rushed back to Rome to coordinate relief efforts. He opened his own palaces to house refugees and organized food distribution, but Romans noticed something suspicious. The fire had conveniently cleared the exact area where Nero wanted to build his golden house. Rumors spread that the emperor had started the fire himself, or at least prevented efforts to stop it. Whether or not Nero was responsible for the fire, his response to the crisis revealed his character. Needing a scapegoat, he blamed Rome's small Christian community. What followed was the first major persecution of Christians in Roman history. They were arrested, tortured, and executed in elaborate public spectacles. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and set on fire to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. The emperor himself participated in these entertainments, driving his chariot among the burning victims while dressed as a charioteer. The persecution of Christians was just one example of Nero's increasing brutality. He had his mother, Agrippina, murdered in 59 CE, first trying to kill her with a collapsible boat, then sending assassins when that failed. He kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage. He forced his former mentor Seneca to commit suicide on trumped-up charges of treason. The list of his victims grew longer each year, including senators, generals, and anyone else who might pose a threat to his rule or simply annoy him. By 68 CE, Nero's grip on power was slipping. Military commanders in Gaul and Spain had declared rebellion. The Senate finally found the courage to declare him a public enemy. As hostile forces closed in on Rome, Nero fled the city in disguise. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged the empire into the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. His 14-year reign had been marked by artistic megalomania, financial excess, and brutal persecution. He had shown that an emperor's personal obsessions could literally burn down the greatest city in the world. But Rome's capacity for producing disastrous rulers was far from exhausted. As we move forward through the centuries, we encounter emperors whose failures took different forms, some through weakness, others through madness, and still others through a toxic combination of incompetence and cruelty. Each serves as a reminder that absolute power, when placed in the wrong hands, can transform even the mightiest empire into a stage for human folly and tragedy. The pattern would repeat itself across cultures and centuries, from the Byzantine Empire to Imperial China, from medieval Europe to the courts of Renaissance Italy. The Forgotten Tyrants, a study in imperial incompetence. By the 9th century of our era, the Byzantine Empire had weathered countless storms. Barbarian invasions, religious upheavals, and dynastic struggles had all tested the resilience of this last remnant of Rome. But in 1055, the empire faced a different kind of threat. Not armies at the gates or theological disputes, but something far more insidious, an emperor who simply refused to rule. Constantine Monomachos had been dead for 2 years, and the throne had passed to his chosen successor, a woman whose very presence on the imperial seat would spark one of the most peculiar chapters in Byzantine history. Theodora Porphyrogenita was not young when she became empress. At 76, she was ancient by medieval standards, a relic of a bygone era who had spent decades in the shadows of the imperial court. But age was not Theodora's greatest weakness as a ruler. Her fatal flaw lay in something far more fundamental. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to avoid making decisions of any consequence whatsoever. The empire she inherited was crumbling at its edges. In the east, the Seljuk Turks pressed ever closer to the heartland of Asia Minor. In the south, Arab raiders continued their centuries-old harassment of Byzantine territories. In the north, new barbarian peoples stirred restlessly beyond the Danube. The empire needed strong leadership, decisive action, and military reform. Instead, it got Theodora. The empress seemed to view the act of governance as an elaborate ceremony rather than a practical responsibility. She would hold court with all the proper rituals, receive ambassadors with appropriate pomp, and sign documents with the correct imperial flourishes. But when it came to the substance of rule, she displayed a remarkable talent for deferral and delay. Military commanders begged for reinforcements that never came. Provincial governors pleaded for guidance that was never given. The imperial treasury hemorrhaged gold on pointless ceremonies, while the army went unpaid. And through it all, Theodora maintained the serene composure of someone who had mistaken the throne for a comfortable chair rather than the command center of an empire. Her court became a peculiar theater of bureaucratic paralysis. Officials would present urgent matters, requiring immediate attention, only to watch as the empress nodded thoughtfully, promised to consider the issue carefully, and then promptly forgot about it entirely. Important documents gathered dust in imperial offices, while their contents became increasingly irrelevant with each passing month. The empress seemed particularly adverse to anything involving military matters. When the theme commanders of Asia Minor sent increasingly desperate reports about Turkish raids, Theodora's response was to commission a series of religious mosaics for the imperial palace. When the Bulgarian frontier erupted in violence, she decided that what the empire really needed was a comprehensive review of monastery property rights. Her approach to foreign policy was equally bewildering. Diplomatic missions would arrive from foreign courts, spend weeks waiting for an audience, finally meet with the empress, and leave with the distinct impression that she had confused them with someone else entirely. Treaties went unsigned, alliances withered, and potential allies drifted away in frustration. But perhaps, most remarkably, Theodora seemed genuinely surprised when her policies, or lack thereof, produced negative results. When told that the eastern provinces were being overrun by Turkish raiders, she expressed puzzlement that anyone would want to cause trouble. When informed that the imperial army was in a state of near mutiny over unpaid wages, she wondered aloud why soldiers needed money when they had the honor of serving the empire. The bureaucracy that surrounded her adapted to this peculiar leadership style by developing an elaborate system of governing without the empress. Important decisions were made in committee, implemented by senior officials, and retroactively attributed to imperial wisdom. It was a functioning shadow government that operated in the empress's name while carefully avoiding any actual consultation with her. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, with the empire stumbling along under the guidance of its faceless administrators. But in 1056, a year into Theodora's reign, disaster struck in the form of a military crisis that could not be managed, deferred, or ignored. The Seljuk Sultan, Tughrul Bey, had died, and his ambitious nephew Alp Arslan had taken control of the Turkish war machine. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content with occasional raids and border skirmishes, Alp Arslan had grander ambitions. He wanted to break Byzantine power in Asia Minor once and for all. The new sultan launched a coordinated campaign that struck simultaneously at multiple points along the eastern frontier. Turkish armies poured across the border in numbers not seen for generations, overwhelming the scattered and undermanned Byzantine garrison forces. City after city fell, and with each victory, Alp Arslan's confidence grew. News of these catastrophes reached Constantinople in a steady stream of increasingly panicked dispatches. The eastern themes were collapsing. Entire provinces were being lost. The heartland of the empire, the wealthy cities and fertile valleys of Asia Minor that had sustained Byzantine power for centuries, was slipping away. The crisis demanded immediate action. Troops needed to be raised, funds allocated, and a competent general appointed to command the response. The Empress was presented with detailed plans for a counter-offensive, complete with troop movements, supply routes, and strategic objectives. Theodora's response was to announce that she was considering a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The proposal was so thoroughly disconnected from reality that even her most sycophantic courtiers struggled to find appropriate words of support. The empire was being invaded, and the Empress wanted to go sightseeing in Jerusalem. It was a moment that crystallized everything wrong with her approach to governance. Fortunately for the empire, Theodora's advisors had grown skilled at creative interpretation of imperial wishes. They explained that surely the Empress meant to say that she was planning a military expedition to secure the pilgrim routes, which would naturally require dealing with the Turkish threat first. The Empress nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that her intentions had been properly understood. But even this bureaucratic sleight of hand could not disguise the fundamental problem. The empire needed leadership, and Theodora was simply not providing it. The military situation continued to deteriorate while the imperial court debated the theological implications of different pilgrimage routes. As 1056 wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Byzantine Empire was being governed by a woman who had confused ruling with existing. Theodora's presence on the throne provided a veneer of legitimacy and continuity, but beneath that surface, the empire was operating on autopilot while its enemies circled ever closer. The Empress seemed genuinely puzzled by the growing crisis atmosphere in the capital. When courtiers approached her with grave expressions and urgent whispers, she would smile benevolently and ask if they needed anything for their comfort. When presented with maps showing the extent of Turkish conquests, she would nod politely and inquire whether the mapmakers had remembered to include all the important monasteries. Her disconnect from reality became a source of dark humor among the palace staff. Servants would exchange stories of the Empress, asking whether the Turkish armies might be interested in converting to Christianity, or wondering if the military situation might improve if everyone simply tried to get along better. But the laughter was tinged with desperation. The empire was bleeding territory and prestige, while its nominal leader treated the whole affair as a minor administrative inconvenience. Something had to change, and as the year drew to a close, it became clear that change would have to come from outside the imperial palace. The crisis that finally forced action came not from the Turkish frontier, but from within the capital itself. In late 1056, word reached Constantinople that Isaac Komnenos, a distinguished general and member of one of the empire's most prominent military families, had raised the standard of rebellion in Asia Minor. Isaac's revolt was not driven by personal ambition or dynastic grievance. It was a desperate attempt by the empire's military leadership to save Byzantium from its own government. The general had watched in horror as province after province fell to the Turks, while the empress concerned herself with palace decorations and religious ceremonies. The rebellion spread with remarkable speed as commanders and officials throughout the eastern provinces declared their support for Isaac. These were not opportunistic rebels seeking personal gain, but loyal servants of the empire who had concluded that loyalty to Theodora meant disloyalty to Byzantium itself. News of the revolt reached the capital just as Theodora was hosting an elaborate ceremony to consecrate a new set of altar cloths for the palace chapel. The empress received the report during a break in the religious proceedings, read it with the same mild interest she might show for the weather report, and returned to the ceremony without comment. Her complete lack of reaction to news of armed rebellion against her rule was perhaps the most damning indictment of her fitness to govern. Any competent ruler, faced with such a crisis, would have immediately begun planning a response, raising loyal troops, securing the capital, negotiating with the rebels, or preparing for siege. Theodora did none of these things. Instead, she continued with her scheduled activities as if nothing had happened. She attended religious services, held routine court ceremonies, and discussed plans for redecorating the imperial apartments. When advisors attempted to brief her on the military situation, she would listen politely and then change the subject to something more pleasant. This surreal disconnection from reality continued even as Isaac's forces approached the capital. Scouts reported rebel armies marching on Constantinople, and still the empress showed no sign of understanding the gravity of the situation. She seemed to view the approaching conflict as she viewed everything else, as someone else's responsibility that would somehow resolve itself without her involvement. The end came with startling suddenness. In August 1057, after barely 2 years on the throne, Theodora abdicated without resistance, protest, or apparent regret. She retired to a monastery where she spent her remaining years in the kind of peaceful contemplation that she had apparently preferred all along to the messy business of governing an empire. Isaac Komnenos ascended the throne and immediately began the difficult work of repairing the damage done by Theodora's reign of studied indifference. He restored military discipline, reorganized the eastern defenses, and launched a series of campaigns to reclaim lost territory from the Turks. But the harm done during those 2 critical years could not be entirely undone. The Byzantine Empire had lost precious time, territory, and prestige during Theodora's reign of elegant incompetence. The Turkish foothold in Asia Minor, established while the empress pondered pilgrimage routes, would eventually grow into the foundation of Ottoman power. Theodora Porphyrogenita represented a unique type of imperial failure, the ruler who governed by not governing, who mistook passivity for wisdom and indecision for prudence. She was not cruel like Caligula, not mad like Commodus, not dissolute like Nero. She was something perhaps worse, completely and utterly ineffective. Her reign serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous rulers are not those who abuse their power, but those who refuse to use it at all. In a world where empires lived and died by the decisions of their emperors, Theodora's greatest sin was not making terrible decisions, but making no decisions at all. The last of the Porphyrogenita dynasty, she embodied the final decay of the system that had sustained the Byzantine Empire for centuries. Her reign marked not just the end of a family line, but the end of an era when the empire could afford rulers who treated the throne as a ceremonial position rather than an active responsibility. In the long catalogue of useless emperors, Theodora stands apart not for her spectacular failures, but for her spectacular absence. She was there, and yet she wasn't. She ruled, and yet she didn't. She presided over the slow dissolution of imperial authority with the same serene detachment she might have shown while watching clouds drift across the sky. Hey guys, tonight we journey into the shadowy corridors of imperial palaces where power corrupts absolutely and incompetence wears a crown. We're exploring the most useless emperors ever, rulers so spectacularly inept they make modern political scandals look like administrative hiccups. These weren't just bad leaders, they were catastrophic disasters wrapped in royal robes, whose reigns left empires crumbling and millions suffering under the weight of their breathtaking stupidity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're born into ultimate privilege, handed the most powerful position on earth, with unlimited resources and the fate of millions in your hands. Now imagine using all of that to play with toy soldiers, chase imaginary conspiracies, or declare war on the ocean itself. Tonight, we're diving deep into the lives of emperors who turned absolute power into absolute catastrophe. Rulers whose incompetence was so legendary it became the stuff of nightmares. From paranoid tyrants who executed their own shadows to delusional monarchs who thought they were gods, these emperors didn't just fail at ruling, they redefined what failure could look like when it wore a crown. Their stories aren't just cautionary tales about power, they're masterclasses in how human incompetence can reach truly epic proportions when given unlimited authority. We'll meet emperors who bankrupted entire civilizations for personal whims, rulers who started wars they couldn't finish, and monarchs whose idea of governance involved more superstition than strategy. These weren't just bad decisions, they were sustained campaigns of imperial negligence that left their empires in ruins and their people in despair. But here's what makes these stories truly fascinating. Each of these emperors believed they were doing the right thing. In their minds, they weren't incompetent disasters, they were visionary leaders whose subjects simply couldn't appreciate their genius. This delusion, this complete disconnect from reality, is what makes their reigns so spectacularly, tragically useless. Tonight's journey will take us across continents and centuries, from the marble halls of Rome to the forbidden palaces of China, from the courts of Byzantium to the chateaux of France. We'll explore how unlimited power, when combined with unlimited incompetence, creates a perfect storm of imperial catastrophe. These emperors didn't just fail their people, they failed the very concept of leadership itself. Their reigns serve as stark reminders that wearing a crown doesn't grant wisdom, that inheriting power doesn't guarantee competence. and that sometimes the most dangerous person in an empire is the one sitting on its throne. So settle in as we explore the fascinating, frustrating, and sometimes utterly bizarre world of history's most spectacularly useless emperors. Because sometimes the best way to understand good leadership is to examine its complete and utter absence. These are the rulers who prove that when it comes to imperial incompetence, there truly is no limit to how badly things can go wrong. You've worked your way through the most incompetent rulers in history, from megalomaniacs who thought they were gods to lazy kings who preferred chickens to kingdoms. You've witnessed emperors who destroyed entire civilizations through sheer stupidity, rulers who bankrupted empires for personal pleasure, and monarchs who literally fiddled while their cities burned. But perhaps the most sobering lesson from all these catastrophic leaders is this: power doesn't create competence, it only amplifies what's already there. Looking back at figures like Commodus, who turned the Roman Empire into his personal gladiator fantasy, or Caligula, who declared war on the sea itself, we see a pattern that transcends centuries and cultures. These weren't just bad rulers, they were warnings written in gold and blood about what happens when absolute power meets absolute incompetence. They remind us that leadership is not a birthright or a privilege, but a responsibility that demands wisdom, restraint, and genuine concern for those being led. The most useless emperors in history shared common traits. They confused their personal desires with the needs of their people. They mistook ceremony for governance, and they believed their own propaganda so completely that they lost touch with reality. Whether it was Honorius obsessing over his pet chickens while barbarians sacked Rome, or Emperor Ai of Tang drowning in luxury while his empire crumbled, these rulers forgot the fundamental truth that a throne is not a reward, but a burden. Perhaps most chilling is how easily these disasters could have been prevented. Many of these emperors inherited stable, prosperous kingdoms. They had advisors, resources, and every advantage that power could provide. Yet through vanity, laziness, or simple incompetence, they managed to destroy in decades what had taken centuries to build. Their failures weren't inevitable, they were chosen. But there's also something oddly comforting about these stories. They remind us that even the mightiest empires are ultimately human institutions, subject to human flaws and human folly. The same weaknesses that brought down ancient dynasties still echo in boardrooms and political chambers today. The names change, the technology advances, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we ensure that those with power use it wisely? These useless emperors serve as eternal reminders that competence cannot be inherited, wisdom cannot be bought, and good leadership cannot be faked. They show us that history is not made by the powerful alone, but by the powerful who choose to serve something greater than themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they prove that no empire, no matter how mighty, is stronger than the character of those who lead it. So the next time you encounter leaders who seem more interested in their own glory than the welfare of those they serve, remember these cautionary tales. Remember that throughout history, the most dangerous people have often been those sitting on thrones, convinced of their own importance while the world burned around them. The most useless emperors ever weren't just failures of their time, they were warnings for ours.